Well, the sun's going down, but we're going to keep reading away here. Film a second one of these to be uploaded the day after the one that I just finished filming. But we are on page 117 of the Anatomy of Bibliomania, with a section titled, What Seek These Studious Ones? In the other extreme or defect of this love of learning, studies, knowledge, scholarship, I know there are such as err in kind and quantity, bookworms, misers of knowledge, moles of print, eternally burrowing in musty tomes without purpose, pendants, missing the sweetness and the light of life. Cousin germain to them are those pretenders of learning, literate fools who sit in wise men's seats, whom the common people hold learned, grave, and wise, and those other vain students whose learning Roger Ascham described as gotten in a summer heat and washed away with the Christmas snow again. The footnote says the schoolmaster. But before I can come to treat of these several errors and obliquities, their causes, symptoms, affections, which I do apart, I must say something of the objects, joys, and allurements of the scholarly passion. What seek they who study with so much avidity, with such absorption? I speak not of those who study for position, occupation, or preferment in profession or trade. Milton, in his trade of poetry, retired to Horton, as he told Diodate, consuming 5 years of solitude in reading ancient papers as a preparation for the writing of Paradise Lost. Et totum repuent me mea vita libri. We've got some Latin there, and our footnote says, from the Biblion, translated Thomas, 96-7. As I've said before, some of these footnotes are unintelligible to the casual reader, me being a casual reader here. But of those who love study for its own sake, who glory in the felicitous studiousness, and that studious felicity which Richard de Bury attributes to the all-powerful eunuch, who, we are told in the Acts, was so mightily kindled by the prophetic books that he ceased not to study on his long journey, banished all thought of the populous palace at Queen Candace, and forgot even the treasures of which he was keeper, ignoring alike the incidents of his journey and the chariot in which he rode. Those who know learning, as Nicholas Breton so eagerly proves and firmly demonstrates, the darling of wisdom and the delight of wit, unpleasing to none that knows her, unprofitable to none that loves her, making age honorable, youth admirable, the virtuous wise and the wise gracious, the nurse of nature, with that milk of reason that would make a child of grace never lie from the dug. Quoting there from Characters upon Essays, Moral and Divine. In the fervor of learning, they find wisdom, which is joy, ecstasy. Whether they seek it or not, it is bliss, for the round of knowledge is like the great and exemplary wheel of heaven. And our footnote is pointing us to Sir Thomas Browne's Pseudodoxia Epidemia, Preface, Works, I-115. Make of that footnote what you will. In the fervor of learning, they find wisdom, which is joy, ecstasy, whether they seek it or not. It is bliss, for the round of knowledge is like the great and exemplary wheels of heaven. Happy is the man that findeth wisdom, and the man that getteth understanding, for the merchandise of it is better than the merchandise of silver, and the gain thereof than fine gold. Proverbs 3:13-14. The scholar and the poet are related in Jobert's opinion, because they become such more for pleasure than by labor. They are impelled or restrained, not by their ambition, but by their genius. They will not be denied, no temptations powerful enough to draw them from their studies, riches, honors, rewards, love, adventures, have no manner of purchase for them. I would rather, Alexander told Aristotle, be first in learning than in wealth and power. Nor can threats, intimidations, or dangers affect them. There are many examples. Richard de Bury, Biblion, relates to Taurus the philosopher out of Aulus Gellius, how the Athenians, hating the people of Megara, decreed that any of them entering Athens should be put to death. But despite that decree, Euclid himself, as a Megarian, was so determined to hear the lectures of Socrates that he disguised himself as a woman, and thus had his wish, traveling from Megara to Athens each night, a distance of 20 miles. The learned fervour of Archimedes was so imprudent and excessive that the same study which saved his life deprived him of it, for, assuming as much glory in saving Archimedes as in destroying Syracuse, Marcellius, after his great Sicilian victory, commanded the soldiers to spare the life of the philosopher. But while Archimedes was making geometrical figures near his home, his eyes fixed upon the ground, a soldier, entering his house, bent on plunder, asked him who he was. The philosopher was so intent that he made him no direct answer, but pointing to the figure, he said, "Have a care not to spoil this circle." Thereupon the soldier, feeling that the victor of the empire had been slighted, drew his sword and cut off the philosopher's head, bending his blood with the lineaments of his art. If learning is denied to men because of their station in life, they will get it all the same as those 2 Chinamen in the 4th century BC, who, being servants in a school, picked up their education by inscribing exercises on the palms of their hands and on their bare legs, and transcribing them at night when they got home. Or on the other side, Chang Xuan, of whom Confucius appeared in a vision, who was rich and so fond of wine, that he is said to have been able to take 300 cups without losing his head. Yet he lived so much for learning that his very slave girls were highly educated, and enlarded their conversation with quotations from the odes, like Sir Maurice Meanwell's servants in the female virtuosos, who became so learned after the example of the heroine of that play, that even his little boy cannot turn the spit without a Pharamond or a Cassandra in his hand. And if he calls for drink, the butler brings him a Spencer or a Ben Jonson. Gills tells also how Quang Hen, a famous minister of the time of the Emperor of Yanti, being born in poverty, entered the service of a wealthy man as a wageless menial for the sole chance of being within reach of books. He had no candles, so at night time bored a hole in the wall between his own and a neighbor's house, and was thus able to filch enough light to carry on his studies with success. No labor in the world too great for them that love learning. And if those labors in our times are reduced by the preservation of books and their general accessibility, in ancient times knowledge was gathered with difficulties which none but the heroic could surmount. Printing not being in use, as Thomas Hearne points out, scholars were forced very often to travel into other countries if they desired, as they did, advantage of any book. Pythagoras traveled into Egypt, and stayed there many years before he could be admitted to a knowledge of their mysteries, returning a complete scholar and philosopher. For aught I know, Hearne continues, he might have understood all those inscriptions which are reported to have been upon the pyramids. That which made the ancients more ready and expert was the art with which they used to strengthen their memories. When they were particularly in love with any author, they not only read him over and over, but would be at the pains of transcribing him several times. Demosthenes so admired Thucydides that he writ him over 8 times with his own hand. And we have other notable instances of that of Petrarch, when on a visit to Liege, finding a good company of books, he transcribed one oration of Cicero with his own hand, and had another written out by a colleague under great difficulties. For in that fair city of the barbarians it was very difficult to get any ink, and what he did was as yellow as saffron and nearer our own time. Dr. Henry Aldrich used often to transcribe the authors he read, especially when he was to print anything. But to such as are well informed, this passion for study is common knowledge. Most of them can augment its history from their own reading or observation, and they will each make answer, in like case, that it is a stimulation in youth, a consolation in age, whatever misadventures affect its less fortunate devotees. But I have not yet sufficiently answered mine own question. To what end? There may be no answer, study itself being an end in itself. I should be well content with that conclusion. For can we be in better condition than happy? Yet some ask more of study, and some have found more, as I have shown. Some have gone so far as to find in learning the key of life and an assurance of immortality. When Dante, in the seventh circle of his Inferno, addresses Brunetto Latini as the dear benign paternal image, such as thine was when so lately thou did teach me the way of man to win eternity, he is referring, Tatham reminds us, to the new secular learning to which Brunetto's work had introduced him, awakening in him the desire for that earthly fame which should make his name immortal. 'Tis a common humour, incident to all men, to applaud and flatter themselves with the notion of earthly fame and heavenly bliss. I doubt not that Dante was among the rest in this business, for men have not, even in our time, learnt to live without reward or purpose. For the joy of living, as they say, or if some have, and I know some have, they are shy in admitting it, fearing, as they well may, the resentment of the venal and the purposeful. But I grow tedious, and must make an end. For I have said enough to the observant, and a nod is as good as a wink to a blind horse. Howbeit, if a purpose you would have for your studies beyond that of immediacy for your trade, on which matter I would not trespass, for it is not my business, take the words of Francis Bacon again, I know none better, where he argues that as both heaven and earth do conspire to contribute to the use and benefit of man, so the end ought to be to separate and reject vain speculation, whatsoever is empty and void, and to pursue, or rather preserve, whatsoever is solid and fruitful, that knowledge may not be as a courtesan for pleasure and vanity only, or as a bondswoman to acquire and gain her master's use, but as a spouse for generation, fruit, and comfort. Let us remember, as Goethe advises after Socrates, not to indulge in empty speculation, but to live and do. And that brings us to the end of that section there. On page 120 of the book. The next section here is studies and old age. But we'll leave it at that for now. The room has gone dark, and I am looking rather ghostly in a glow.